All right, everyone. Can you hear me and see my screen?
Yes.
Sick. Thank you. So thank you all for logging in today. This is the second business development webinar in a series of 7. Don't worry if you weren't here for the first one. It's not a sort of prerequisite. You don't need to know what we covered last week to learn from today's material. My name is Dominic. I am the Business Development Student Manager over at the Student Startup Center at UC Davis. And this workshop series is meant to prepare you all to compete in the Startup Week business competition. But even if you decide not to do that, it is hopefully material that will prove quite helpful for you in your own entrepreneurial journeys. So what are we covering today? We're going to be talking about how to validate the legitimacy of a market once you've kind of identified the problem that you're going to be working on. We're going to be discussing the different external factors that affect success. You can have a great idea for a product, but there might be a lot of other things that you can't control that might affect your success. And then we'll be talking about a more concrete application of your understanding of the market to the development of a solution. So to start off, validating the market. So once you've identified a problem, which is kind of what we talked about last week, it's really critical that you make sure that there are, first off, paying customers. And second, that you can get a product ready quickly enough to those customers. So when it comes to paying customers, the buzzword we like to throw around is Beachhead Market. Beachhead Market is really just the first segment of the total addressable market that you target. And we do that we have a more concentrated effort such that we can, be more effective, that we can acquire those initial customers and then grow. When you try to address a large market from the get-go, there's a lot of...
I'll have to focus for a second.
Sorry? Okay. All right. Whenever you're trying to address too large of a market right away, there's a lot of costs associated with that. And so it's generally more effective and efficient to start with a smaller market and then grow from there. So what do these markets look like? The two main categories are that they're well-funded and well-connected. You want them to be well-funded because, they're essentially funding your venture as you grow. Even if you have venture dollars, revenue streams are a very important way of keeping your business running early on. And you want them to be well-connected because if you're going to be growing from this initial target segment, you want them to have a channel of communication with adjacent markets. And I'll be giving a more concrete example of this later on, but basically you don't want your beachhead market to be isolated because then your company won't be able to spread from them. And so when we're talking about getting a product ready and determining whether it can be produced quickly enough, it's pretty challenging because there's a lot, predicting how long it's going to take to make a product kind of requires some expertise in the area. And there's always going to be, hiccups along the way. So there's not like a real surefire way to say, oh yeah, this product's going to take 6 months. Oh yeah, this product's going to take 9 months. But there are some general tips. The first one that I would give is have an early MVP. As soon as you can, get a minimum viable product to kind of verify, to validate your early assumptions, to show that this problem, this job that needs to be done, it's real. And people want it to be solved. People want that job done. And it kind of, helps you point out flaws in your initial product. The second thing I would say is don't worry, don't stress about being too early, too late. It is an issue if you move too quickly, you won't have a very good product, and you'll kind of risk that uh, having a bad first impression. But if you're too late, other competitors might take up the market before you can get there. So what I would recommend is don't worry too much about that. Focus on getting a really good product, because at the end of the day, your customer, whether it's the consumer or a consumer like you or I, or some sort of business or government agency, they're going to want the best product. Just don't, come out with your thing 2 years after the first guy. And the third thing is have a good justification. So a justification for your timeline. Maybe 6 months is a sufficient runtime for you and for your product, but why is that the case? And it's not just knowing that you're actually going to take 6 months. That's useful, but it's also really it's professional and it's comforting to know that something's going to take 6 months or 9 months or however long it's going to take. Going through the process of saying, what are the features I want to implement? What sort of skill sets will I need in order to create those features? Who am I going to have to hire to create those features, and how long is it going to take them to build those out? Going through each of those kind of thought experiments is going to make you better prepared to execute them. Dwight D. Eisenhower has this pretty famous quote that planning is essential, but plans are useless. And so this is kind of along those lines, where constantly thinking about what you're doing next and why you're doing it is going to be really beneficial for you in the long run, even if nobody ever sees your written up justification for how long your thing's going to take. So before we move on, is there any questions on that? Cool. And again, I'll be giving a much more concrete example in a bit. So moving on to external factors. In a perfect capitalist utopia, a company can build a product, sell it, and profit, and that's it. But that's not the real case in the real world. So in the real world, there's a lot of various roadblocks that are going to get in your way, and a successful entrepreneur is aware of those, or makes themselves aware of those, and comes up with a plan to subvert them or deal with them. I identified a couple of kind of key areas of external factors that you should be thinking about, should be addressing. The first is incentive structures, and then entrenched players and bureaucracy. So, incentive structures. So what is an incentive? An incentive is, it's pretty simple. It's something that motivates you to do something. They can be intrinsic or they can be extrinsic. An intrinsic incentive is simply, something that's non-physical, something that's emotional or intellectual. I'll give you an example. I don't buy textbooks because I think they have material value. I don't even buy textbooks because I necessarily am going to read them and want all the knowledge in them. I buy textbooks because I want to look smart. And textbooks, make people look smart. So that's an intrinsic motivator. It's a sense of pride. It's a sense of value that I get from having this product. Extrinsic motivators, incentives, however, are quite material. They're monetary, or they're somehow physical. So some examples of this might be, hey, fill out my survey and I'll give you $5, or give me a bunch of money and I'll give you a shiny new car. So in each of these examples, there's always an exchange. It's always a transaction. And this is always the case. If you feel like you're ever in a situation where you're getting something, but not necessarily giving, it's probably because the thing you're giving is intrinsic. It's not physical. Or maybe it's something that is material or extrinsic rather. It has value, but it's not visual. You can't see it. Like data is a really good example of, we're on Facebook all the time, we're on Instagram all the time, especially now. And we get a lot of satisfaction, dopamine rushes from that, some pretty intrinsic benefits. And in return, we're giving these companies our information. We're allowing them to put ads on our screens. So there's an exchange going on. We're just not totally aware of it. So incentive structures are essentially just the network of transactions which are facilitated by these incentives. And again, I'll give a more concrete example of that in a bit when we talk about entrenched players. So ultimately, incentive structures are kind of just meant to help answer the question, why do people make decisions they otherwise wouldn't? Or rather, what do I have to give you in order for you to buy my product or pay for my service or engage with me? Does that make sense? Cool. So I'm gonna call some people out, get some participation. If you don't have a mic, please yell at me in the chat. Let's say Eva. Can you give me an example of an intrinsic motivator or incentive in your day-to-day life? See if I can go to the chat. Can't use a mic. Okay, same question. Mia. So in the chat, how would you determine the external factors by asking a potential customer directly? Yeah, so by external, I'm assuming you mean the extrinsic motivators. Those are usually pretty obvious. It's the exchanging of money. It's the, okay, thank you. I apologize for the bird in the background. So yeah, so extrinsic motivators are usually pretty straightforward. They're usually tracked in a very concrete way. If you're, again, going back to the social media example, you have a certain amount of data that you're collecting from an individual. If you use, going to the grocery store as an example, it's the pounds of fruit that you're buying or the amount of money that you're spending. There's generally a cost associated with it. On the flip side of that, intrinsic motivators or incentives generally don't have that. It's a feel good or it's a motivation that generally you can't associate a concrete cost with. Does that make sense? Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and move on. Entrenched players. So we're gonna be talking about Instagram and Facebook. Yeah, for sure. So when Instagram started out, and even still today, it started out as an image sharing platform. That's kind of exclusively what it did. Now it has videos, short videos, Instagram TV, stuff like that. But for the most part, it's image sharing. And so when it launched, there was really no social media platform with a monopoly or even a market plurality on image sharing. There's things like Tumblr or Pinterest, but they had a greater variety of content. Instagram was really focused on this one thing. And so you could definitely argue that because of that, Instagram has no competitors. There's nobody in the market that's doing what they do. And one problem that I see with a lot of early startups is, oh, nobody's doing exactly what I'm doing, therefore I have no competitors. That's pretty dumb. And the reason why is because this approach neglects to consider, in the case of Instagram, Facebook, the social media giant, which if you're familiar at all with social media, I'm sure you kind of have an intuitive understanding of why that's an issue. But in order to understand this in a more concrete way, and in order to talk about it, it's useful to draw out Facebook's incentive structure. So I have done that, and I apologize for the crude drawing, but I didn't want to like type it up and stuff. It'd take too long. So this is a very simplified drawing of Facebook's incentive structure. There are a couple of other players that they work with, users, people like you or I, shareholders, the people who own Facebook, which is actually mostly Mark Zuckerberg. I believe he owns a majority share. And then ad agencies, who are Facebook's primary customer, actually. So you'll see in each of these relationships, there's a transaction going on. Each player is giving the other some sort of incentive to have that partnership. We, the users, are giving Facebook our personal information, and in return, we're getting content. Shareholders get paid dividends, and in return, they give them the permission to operate. They give them authority, essentially. And with ad agencies, Facebook gives them aggregate data to hone their ads, as well as ad space itself. And in return, ad agencies pay them. So I'll leave it up to volunteers for now, but
what type of content does Facebook give to users?
Good question. A lot of it's actually user generated. So you could argue that it's actually a platform that it's offering, but things like, when you're scrolling down and you see memes or videos, that's content that's being channeled through Facebook. So if anyone wants to chime up, why do we think Instagram butts into Facebook's incentive structure? Why is Facebook an issue for Instagram?
Since Facebook is just like a social media platform, just like Instagram, they basically take up some users. Like some people are more dedicated to using Facebook than they are Instagram and vice versa. So that means that Instagram does not have as much of a population to be used as like aggregate data for like ad agencies.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's what I was thinking when I was coming up with this. Instagram is taking screen time from Facebook. They're taking ad spots away, so it's cutting like right into their business. It's because of this kind of annoyance that Instagram is for Facebook, that we really have to consider Facebook as an entrenched player. It's someone who directly affects our business, assuming we're Instagram in this situation. Now, this isn't always bad, and in the case of Instagram, it's actually a really good thing. In 2012, Facebook bought Instagram for $1 billion. So that's a pretty good turnout for them, and it really worked in everyone's favor. Instagram's founder and their team, they only had 13 employees at the time. They made plenty of money off of it. And Facebook got to keep its flow of information and its flow of data, of advertisements as well. So it's really important to think about, who are the players in my field. What are their incentive structures? Why are they, involved in this business? And how might I get in their way? Maybe you want to avoid them. Maybe you want to be annoying. Maybe you want to be one of those companies that their whole exit strategy is getting bought by one of these giants like Facebook, Google, Amazon, or one of the others. But in either case, super important to be aware of that. Oh yes, and then just a quick definition for you. An entrenched player is a company, government agency, or individual whose incentive structure or structures you in some way impact. So in the case of Instagram, they cut into their user screen time, which was an issue, and it resulted in them getting bought. So the third external factor, which I won't spend too much time on because it's kind of a drag, is bureaucracy. There are two constants in life, death and taxes. Who collects your taxes? Bureaucracy. So at some point, you have to deal with them if you haven't already. And if you ever start a company or even work for a company, you will deal with them. And it's a good thing, being held accountable, personally, I think is important. But it's also important to keep in mind who you're going to have to work with and how you're going to do that. And navigating the world of bureaucracy and legislation is super difficult. It's something that takes a lot of time to learn really well. And for that reason, my recommendation is always to get some help. Find mentors, find advisors. If you have the money, hire consultants to help you navigate the world of regulations and such. And know your acronyms. The government loves to use acronyms, and so you're going to have to get used to them. Food and Drug Administration, Federal Communications Commission, Environmental Protection Agency, Better Business Bureau, Federal Aviation Administration, Securities and Exchanges Commission, and then National. You don't need to know NASA. NASA's NASA. So if you work on a product, you're going to have to deal with multiple of these at some point. And again, we'll be going through a concrete example in a moment, talking about which ones. So before we move on to the third segment of today, do we have any questions on external factors? And feel free to throw them in the chat. I actually have it open so I can read it now. Okay. So you've collected all this information. You know so much about the market. You're a plethora of knowledge. But now you actually want to start a company and make a product and start producing revenue. So last week, to contradict what I said last week, what I'll say now is knowledge is power, but it's only if you can apply it correctly. So how do you do that? How do you apply this knowledge that you've gained? So in order to do this, we'll start by defining our jobs to be done, a sort of a different approach to the problem you're solving. We'll define these jobs as product requirements. Our product or service, whatever it is, has to do with these jobs in order to be successful, in order to sell. And that's actually a pretty direct line. Maybe the job to be done is farmers in the Central Valley need wells to be dug. They need more water, and well water is the most direct source. So our requirement for the product or the service is we need to drill wells. It's as simple as that. And so from those requirements, you develop features, parts and components, or the entirety of your product or service to accommodate and meet those requirements. If my requirement is I need to be able to drill wells of consistent quality at a high rate, then my feature will be, let's say, local teams of laborers who are well trained in operating equipment and can be deployed quickly and efficiently. That might be a couple of features, kind of a little long, it's a feature. Now, once you have that, it's really important to iterate. You're never going to get it right the first time, and it's important to recognize that. So I'll give you a really concrete example. Right now, as I am speaking to you, my job to be done is to educate undergrads at UC Davis in the realm of business development theory. So that's my job. It's actually my job. And so a requirement of that I've derived is I need to organize and present these biz dev theories in a clear and applicable way. So I have developed a feature, which is a slide deck effectively that prioritizes concise presentation of information and relevant examples. So that's my job, that's my requirement, that's my feature. Now, where does iteration come in? Well, if you were here last week, hopefully you'd have seen a market improvement in the quality of this presentation. You know, last week I gave an example relating to washing dishes. And while I feel like it was probably a fine visualization of what I was trying to present, it wasn't very clearly directly applicable to business. So I've iterated and made sure that all of my examples today are directly applicable to business. It's an iteration that I've done to improve my product, which is this talk, this conversation. And I will continue to iterate based on customer feedback, based on what you all tell me, based on what my colleagues tell me, and based on what I think, on how I think I did. So that's a pretty, I feel like that's as concrete as I can get, because you're, engaging in it right now. All that said, it's not super necessary to think of your problem, your business, your job to be done in this context. Requirements and features is something that works for me personally, just because I'm an engineer, and requirements are part of my life every day. Features are a part of my life every day. So, what I encourage you to do as entrepreneurs, aspiring entrepreneurs or active ones, is to take these ideas and iterate, adapt them, change them however you see fit or feel is necessary to be successful in your careers. So before we move on to the big example, are there any questions on application of market knowledge? And again, feel free to throw them in the group chat. All right. So in an effort to, again, make this pretty concrete, I wanted to go through an example, a business case example of these kind of 3 different areas. So based on what we talked about last week, let's say hypothetically that we come up with a problem that is composed of the following. Small farmers can't reliably predict farm output due to a number of reasons we won't go into because they're probably technical and gross. New farmers or hobbyist gardeners suffer more so from this issue because they're less experienced than generational farmers. And finally, all of this leads to poor farm efficiency and return on equity, how much revenue they're generating relative to how much their stuff is worth. So that's our problem. That's kind of what we're given, and really what we would have derived previously. So first, let's validate the market. Let's say, hey, let's make sure that we have paying customers. So when we look at potential customers, let's say we've identified these 3 groups. Small farmers, they have some capital, but they're certainly not wealthy. They're not giant corporations like J.D. Haskell. They're mom and pop farms that have been there for generations, or maybe even just 1 or 2. So they have money, but they're by no means rich. Our second group of potential customers are new farmers, but they're very capital limited because they're new. They have to invest a lot in their equipment, their property, things like that. And the third group are hobbyists. They're probably super well funded. They have nice cushy jobs, and they do gardening as not necessarily necessity, but for fun. But they don't necessarily have good connections to farmers. So I'm going to call on Gene. Who do you think we should select as our beachhead market?
I kind of missed the earlier part about beachhead markets. So
Sure, I'll reiterate it real quick. Beachhead markets should have two quality. Actually, can I go back in the? Yes, I can go back. Excellent. Yeah, so beachhead markets should generally be well-funded and well-connected. They're the first group of customers that you reach out to so that you can get revenue, but also grow from there.
okay, so it probably would it be like the small businesses would be like the larger ones?
So you're saying
Or
these? One more slide.
yeah.
There we go.
Oh yeah, so small farmers or
Yeah, that's I agree. That's what I came up with. And why would we choose small farmers of these three?
the new farmers are capital limited and the hobbyists don't have connections, so they both lack like half of the stuff for the beachhead market that would be good for it.
For sure. Yeah, so those two are fairly clearly not what we should be focusing on. Parth, I think you raised your hand.
Yeah, I was just gonna say the same thing. I thought maybe both of them are applicable to be a beachhead. What was it?
Beachhead market.
Yes, because both like small farmers and the hobbyists, because one has connections and one has capital.
For sure. Yeah, so another way to think about connections, or another way I like to think about connections is the legitimacy associated with it. So the reason why I personally would pick small farmers, aside from having some modest capital, is there's a legitimacy associated with it. You know, when we go to the farmers market, we're buying from small farmers. We're not buying from these massive corporations. You know, we're buying from the people who grew the stuff with their own hands. And so we have a kind of an innate respect for that sort of craftsmanship, if you will. So yeah, so we'll choose beachhead market for as we'll choose our beachhead market to be these small farmers. The small farmers looking to improve their farm output at fairly minimal cost. And one thing I would stress at this point, and probably will you know, kind of later on as well, is you know, going through this process, you can come up with a different variety of outcomes. You know, maybe even starting at the beginning, we identify different aspects of our problem area or interest area that leads us to a different problem. Maybe we don't come up with what I gave you at the start of this. And maybe we even identify more customers or potential customers than just these. So take that into consideration. This is again kind of like a restrictive view. So now let's look at product readiness. Not so much the features of the product, but you know, generally what might it look like. So generally speaking, products are software-based, hardware-based, or mixed. There's different aspects of both involved. And so we want to come up with a timeline for a possible solution, both an MVP and an initial product. One special case or special situation with this case is farmers often have an apprehension when dealing with startups. You know, this is just kind of a result of people not or potential entrepreneurs not really trying to understand their what's apprehension. Yeah, apprehension is like I'm hesitant to go forward with something. I'm hesitant to even try your product because I and other people like me have had bad experiences with entrepreneurs. So that's one special case that you'd be dealing with in this situation. So, you know, with all of that said, ideally, you have some experience in the area of hardware, software, of ag tech. And so you'll have a good idea of where to start. And again, you know, going through the process of coming up with a good timeline of how long this will take, developing such a product, is very useful. So let's say we've continued on and we started to look at incentive structures. And we found that there's no clear pre-existing transaction within the existing incentive structure that we fit into. You know, the incentive structure is there, but there's no clear, you know, tech startup gets injected into small farm. Like that doesn't really exist. So because of that, we have to build our own component of the incentive system in order to entice customers. And you know, generally it's a good idea to have a really good customer service department. It's a very good idea, but especially in a situation like this where, you know, there's no clear cut role for us to plug into, it's even more important now that we have a really great customer service program to educate our potential customers, to acquire those customers, and to make sure that they have a good experience with our product. So that'll kind of guide a lot of the investments that you make outside of even just your product. So now we take a look at entrenched players. You know, in this area, there's some startups trying to improve agricultural efficiency, you know, some people making robots to pick strawberries, things like that. But most of it's focused on big ag. So we don't have too much, you know, players, small business players in our realm. There are numerous research institutes studying plant output. So our incentive structures kind of match where we're trying to improve small farm efficiency or food production efficiency in general. So, hey, maybe there's a collaboration there. That's something we should look into. And then there's a few large companies that are market adjacent, you know, companies that rely on large farms, farms run by, you know, company employees as opposed to, you know, the people who live and work on the farm. And they're market adjacent and potential problems. You know, if we do a really good job at increasing output with small farmers, you know, that might affect the local supply chain. You know, that might, you know, anger some large companies or even grocers, you know, like Safeway or whoever else. So taking that into account, figuring out where am I going to cut into business with these people, and how can I either become so much of an annoyance that, hey, I get acquired, or how do I make sure to avoid that or even work with it? So those are kind of the things you want to think about when talking about the entrenched players. And then bureaucracy. The biggest one is the FDA. You know, you're working with farms, you're working with food. The FDA is probably going to come into a play, and you're going to have to get licensing or get approved from there. The FCC. So something that not a lot of people think about is if you have you know, a little piece of hardware that plugs into a tree or whatever, and that piece of hardware communicates with a computer in the farmer's home, and you're making a lot of these things and you're sending them out, you have to get FCC approval for that. You have to get licenses to build and sell those sensors or those pieces of hardware. Now, luckily, they're pretty easy to get. You can just, you know, say, hey, I need 10,000 licenses of this commercial class, and the FCC will be like, yeah, sure, you know, your technical specs work out, and you'll get that in you know, less than a month. And then third, you're probably going to have to deal with state agricultural agencies. So like for example, the California Department of Fish and Game. If the farmers you're working with are raise livestock, you're probably going to have to interact with them at some point. Make sure that your product doesn't interfere with the quality of life for these animals, or doesn't affect or contradict any existing laws. So you've gone through, you've identified these entrenched players, you've gone through, you've figured out your beachhead market, kind of generally what your product might look like. And so you're ready to come up with a list of requirements. And you've determined that in order for your product to be successful on a functional level, it needs to collect data on plant health and its output. It needs to analyze that data to produce useful information. Farmers aren't going to understand zeros and ones. I certainly don't. So you're going to need to be able to process that information and give useful information, decision making, things like that for the farmers, so they actually get something out of your product. And then you're going to want to display that information in a clear and easy to use user interface or UI. I can't count the number of times that I've logged on to a website that I was required to for school or for whatever else. And I hated being on it because it was clunky, it was gross. I didn't want to work on it. And the only reason I did was because I was forced to. Now imagine I had to do that voluntarily. Well, obviously I'm not going to. So UI is quite important. And so in this example, I didn't quite go through the process of building a product because it's pretty specific, but it is my hope that this has been concrete enough for you to get some good information out of it. So a quick couple of final notes. So like I said earlier, this process can take you in a lot of different directions. You could easily come up with something that's like super different, a super different set of product requirements, going through the same process, going through the same steps, and even starting with the same problem description. And it's not a bad thing. We all think differently. We have a diverse set of thought processes. And that's one of the great things about, going to school at Davis is there's so many different people from so many different backgrounds. And so just recognize that, if you were to go through this process and I were to go through this process and we come up with super different things, that's normal and probably should happen. If we come up with the same thing, then that might be a little weird. Also note that this process, when you're really going through it and you're really trying to start a company, it can take days, weeks, or even months, depending on how much research you're putting into it and how much work you're putting into it, how many iterations you do. The longer you take is not necessarily a bad thing. It's reasonable to think that you're coming up with a better product, a more accurate product, but also know when to move on, And then finally, it's important to check in with your potential customers throughout these iterations to see what they like, see what they don't like, in order to refine your MVP and your initial product. So that's all that I have. Thank you very much for logging in. I truly do hope that you got some useful information. Will I share the slides? Sure. If you want to type your email into this thingy, I will email you the slides. And then also this whole Zoom thingy will be posted online in some way. Don't know how yet, but hopefully I will soon. Cool. So thank you. And if you have any questions, I'll be on for a minute. Anthony, yeah, basically, there's some pre-processing that goes in, that's involved with that. you can't just take personal information and then sell that to companies. There's a lot of regulations involved preventing that. So aggregate data, another way to think of it, if you're familiar, is like metadata. It's stuff that's pretty separated from the individual, but is still useful to ad agencies.
Hi, I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so when it's coming to the to customers like apprehension, like for instance, if I have like a minimal viable product that the customers really like or the customer wanted right now, but it's probably, I mean, when it's actually going to manufacture or like going to available for public, it's gonna take probably from a very amount of time, probably from 6 months to even 2 years. But so how do you like, I mean, keep their expectation while you're still developing this product? So is there like a way, or I mean, how do you?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a really good question. And I don't know if there's a clear cut way to answer it. I think what I would do is, if I have customers that like want to pay me for a product for an MVP, I would figure out how can I accelerate my timeline. How can I get them a better, refined, a more reliable form of this product more quickly. Maybe I don't want to mass produce right now. Maybe I want to take it easy for the next 6 months and develop a more loyal customer base that's local. And then maybe later on take that to investors and say, hey, I have this product. It wasn't even finished and people really wanted it. So, why don't you give me, $2 million, $3 million, whatever, to scale this and to bring it to mass market. So yeah, I would consider shifting my kind of way of thinking and think of the possibility that maybe going to scale right now isn't the best decision. Maybe focusing on profitability is better.
Yeah, I think that's a great advice, and yeah, so yeah, it's always, I mean, when it goes to a timeline, it's always really tricky because it kind of affects your manufacturer and your like your market, because yeah, so yeah, because I'm currently, I mean, I just have a kind of similar situation, like doing a project for another company, but right now I couldn't promise them like how long it will take to actually manufacture this, because now it's just like a minimal viable product, but I just couldn't, I don't have enough information or like enough resource to tell them how do you gonna put it to manufacture. Like they're expecting you to tell them how long it takes, but I don't know I don't know a way to phrase
Yeah.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a
so
pretty tough situation. I was actually in a situation like that,
mhm,
quite similar, pretty recently,
mhm,
and yeah, it's a tough bit. I think a possible answer would be that maybe you're not the most qualified person to take it to mass market. I know in my situation, I certainly wasn't.
mhm,
I developed an MVP for this company, and they liked it and they wanted to produce a lot of it, but I'm not a production engineer. I don't necessarily know how to do that.
mhm.
And so similar to the situation of navigating bureaucracy, what I would recommend in this situation is find people who do know what they're talking about. Maybe you really don't want to pass up this opportunity. It's a really good career opportunity, and I would understand it and support that. So find people who know what they're talking about and get advice from them. I know a bit about business theory. I know a bit about engineering, but I'm by no means a manufacturing engineer. So finding someone who is, I think would be a really good next move.
Yeah, definitely. I think yeah, that helps a lot.
Cool.
All right.
Okay.
All right.
Well,
Thank you
thank
for your
you.
time and thank you for your lectures today.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.